Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining tonight's webinar hosted by the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation. Our webinar, The Role of Research in Improving Care for Patients with Pediatric Cardiomyopathy, will be presented to us by Dr. Daphne Hsu. My name is Susan Hepworth. I'm the Executive Director of the Children's Cardiomyopathy Foundation, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel. Just a quick introduction about Dr. Hsu. She is a professor of pediatrics and medicine at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and an attending cardiologist at Children's Hospital at Montefiore. And notably, Dr. Hsu has been a longtime member of CCF's Medical Advisory Board. So with that, Dr. Hsu, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. One quick thing though first, we have allotted time at the end for question and answer. So using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you can submit your questions at any time during Dr. Hsu's talk. So don't feel like you need to hold those questions until the end. Rather, just go ahead and type them in as they come to your mind. And then once we get to the question and answer period, I'll be able to read those aloud to Dr. Hsu. So Dr. Hsu, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, you can get started.
Okay, thanks, Susan, and welcome. Very happy to be here tonight and talking about something I really do value, which is research in pediatric cardiomyopathies. I do feel that it has had a very important role in improving care of patients with cardiomyopathy. So let's just start out thinking about kids. So we have a saying in pediatrics, children are not small adults. And I think this is definitely true, as you all know, having had children, they're not really like adults for a lot of different reasons. And some of the reasons are relevant to research. So let's start with thinking about the diseases in children. The diseases in children compared to adult diseases are very different in their causes. We have a lot of patients, especially in cardiomyopathy, who have a genetic cause for their cardiomyopathy, whereas adults, many of the patients who have poor function have it because they've had a heart attack or high blood pressure or some other reason that's caused that heart to not work well. Our children also have metabolic diseases, meaning although we might not know the exact genes, we do know that the heart, as it takes care of its metabolism of the electrolytes and the proteins and everything that you eat to make your heart stronger, doesn't really process that correctly. That makes the heart weaker. Children are different in cardiomyopathy patients compared to adults in the way that the cardiomyopathy affects the children. How does it affect children, and what does it affect in their daily lives, and how does it look toward their future? Certainly, it has physical effects. If your heart's not working well, you're not going to be able to do your normal activities like go to school, play sports, grow. And also, it can affect children as they're developing and affect their mental capacities. They might not have enough energy in the way that they want to, develop. They can't develop because their heart can't supply enough blood. And those are limitations that are really more specific to children than adults. Adults don't have the developing body that needs more energy to help them grow and learn about the world and interact with the world in a way that we see in the young babies and even the small children and adolescents. Another difference between the diseases in children and adults are the outcomes. Adults with heart failure are often stricken with heart failure, but survive quite a long time because they compensate well as they're growing older. Whereas children sometimes have a very acute illness and get quite ill because they've gone from a normal heart to a heart that doesn't work well at all. On the other hand, children also have a better capacity to get better. We have children with terrible cardiomyopathies that improve and almost normalize their function, whereas adults very rarely have that change from very bad to very good. So the diseases, although they might look similar on the echocardiogram, look actually very different when you look at the children and how they respond to their disease and what we expect the disease to do for them in their long-term future. There are also differences in children when you think about starting treatments compared to adults. One of the major differences we think about is that the age of the child can affect what the side effects are of the drugs we want to use to treat or the machines we want to use to support the children. The doses can be different. You can have a dose in a normal adult that would be completely inappropriate for a small baby. And that can be a very big challenge for us to decide, well, how are we going to give the proper dose to get the proper effect? In addition, children are hard to give medications to. Adults, you take one pill, and often there's 1 or 2 or 3 types of pills, different sizes, and that's it. And adults have enough options that they can get a good dose of their medications just from those 3 different types of pills. Whereas children, as they're growing, have a very big difference in what kind of medication and the amount of medication they need. So we need liquid preparations to give to kids who can't swallow pills or kids who need a small amount. And the frequency of medication administration might be different because children metabolize the medications more quickly. So instead of giving something once a day, you might have to give it twice a day. And again, in therapies, we have to decide who we're going to treat. And it's a challenge in children because we want to make sure we use the proper therapy for the proper child, that the long-term outcomes that we would expect without the therapy are worse than with the therapy. And sometimes that can be harder to decide in children when we don't really know exactly how our children are going to respond to the therapies or even how they respond to their diseases. So the argument for research in children is that children are not small adults. You can't take the research that has been performed in large populations of adult patients and translate it into children because of the differences in their diseases and how they might respond to therapies. So what do we learn from research? I think one of the first things that we learn from the research that we've been doing over the past 30 years in cardiomyopathy is the, quote, natural history of the disease. Doctors talk about natural history, meaning what if you didn't treat the disease? If you gave no therapies, what would happen to that child? And what we're seeing is from these registries, we learn what we do know, what in the registry reinforces our knowledge. Yes, this child will get better, this child will get worse. And we also are learning what we don't know, that some of the children surprisingly worsen when we don't expect them to, or get better when we thought they would not get better on their own. We also learn from registries what we don't know that we don't know. There's things that are surprising to us. Oh, look at that gene can cause this problem. And this is the issue that affects these children the most. It could be a rhythm problem. It could be heart failure. It could be all different kinds of comorbidities, or as we say, complications from the disease that we didn't expect. And a natural history study can tell us about that disease, which is very important as we plan, once again, how we're going to treat, or should we treat, a complication or a disease, because we'd like to know this is going to truly make the patient better and not make the patient worse. What else can we learn from research? We can learn more about therapies. As I said, sometimes we don't know exactly how therapies will affect the children, so research is really important. And if you think about the drugs that we use in children with heart failure, or children overall, over 50% of the drugs used in children to treat all different types of diseases have not been studied in children. That means that we're using them, they say, off-label, which doctors are allowed to do. And that means that studies have not been performed to look at their efficacy, how well they work, or their safety. A lot of that is due to finances. Honestly, the industry has support for new medications, but not so much for support for medications that are available generically. So studies aren't performed. So we actually use quite a lot of medications in heart failure that have not been approved for use in children with heart failure. Medications such as Lasix and Allopril, digoxin, propranolol, all medications that would seem familiar to a parent of a child who has a cardiomyopathy. And surprisingly, we don't have a study that says, oh, this medication will work in children. What we're often doing is saying, well, it worked in adults with a similar echo, so we hope that it will work in children. And we also know, quite honestly, we have a lot of safety data because we've been using it for so many years. So we know we do know it's safe, but do we really know that it has good efficacy that will work to help the disease that we're trying to treat? So these are two arguments for why research is important, and there are different types of research that are performed depending on what we're trying to find out. So what are the types of research studies that we do? I think very early on, when we started to have spreadsheets and computers, we did a lot of retrospective studies, retrospective cohort studies, which is a look back at patients that we had cared for. It's really real world information. These are patients that we had in our practices. We take a look and see how they did, what happened to them, what were the complications of the diseases that they had. Unfortunately, it's a little difficult to compare the groups of patients in this kind of analysis because they are different. They're treated differently. They may come from different centers where practices and cultures are different, and what kind of medications are used, and how the approach is to start advanced therapies such as transplant or ventricular assist device. And it's very difficult to compare and say, oh, this group of patients did better than that, because there's too many differences in the patients themselves. That's called a retrospective cohort study, but the value of that is that we can take a look and see, well, exactly what have we seen over the past 10 years with these patients? What kind of things can we learn to inform any kind of prospective studies that we would like to do? So a prospective cohort study, and cohort medicine really means a group of patients. A cohort could be a group of soldiers going to go on a march, or a cohort of people going to do a sports match. But for us, it's a cohort of patients. We say, well, they're similar enough that we want to look at them, and we're going to look at how they do after we enroll them. We have a little bit more control that way, so it's a look forward. Cohort is still real world information. We're putting in the information we find out about the patients into the database, but we're not trying to change the way the patients are treated. And it still can be difficult to compare the groups of patients, once again, because different centers, different doctors might treat people differently, even going forward. But you can get a little more information because you're looking at the information in real time. You're trying to collect certain pieces of information, such as an echo report, a number on an echo, or a lab value that people have had. So you have a little more control over the type of data that you can acquire in that situation. And we do a lot of prospective cohort studies in pediatric cardiomyopathy and pediatric heart transplant. Observational studies are even a little improvement, or an improvement on prospective cohort studies. The improvement is that it's a look forward, but in this case, we usually have developed care guidelines. Those are clinical care guidelines. We say, well, we agree, a group of our investigators got together, a group of doctors, and we'll say, we're going to use these medications, we're going to do this testing, we're going to try to do it on these schedules because we think that's the best clinical care. But at the same time, we could acquire information that is a little more standardized amongst centers to allow us to compare how our patients doing. And we also can know a little bit more about the patients as we enroll, so we can compare risk factors. It's still difficult to compare treatments because in these studies, we're not advocating any particular treatment. We're asking people, what do you do and how do you do it? And let's see what happens to those patients when you do what you normally do. So the gold standard for research studies, as we all have heard in the news and reports on any disease, is the clinical trial. So what's the difference between a clinical trial and a retrospective cohort, or prospective cohort, or observational study? Well, a clinical trial is a look forward, similar to the observational trials, but it has specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we say, which patients are we going to study? Let's try to get a same group of patients so that we can then, what they call randomize. We can say, all right, let's try one treatment versus another in patients who really look the same. If they look the same, we would think they would have the same outcomes, and we'll be able to see if the outcomes are different depending on whether they got treatment A or treatment B. So this is a very powerful tool to compare treatments. I think one of the limitations of a clinical trial is that it may not reflect the real world because all patients don't fit into an inclusion and exclusion table. They have something a little different and they might get excluded from a clinical trial, but still the question would be, well, is the medication or treatment we're studying going to benefit a patient who didn't quite fit the inclusion and exclusion criteria? Let's look at some examples of different types of trials that have been performed in pediatric cardiomyopathy patients. This is a paper that was published in 2003, and it was looking at the incidence of pediatric cardiomyopathy in 2 regions of the United States. Back in 2003, or when in 1993, when this study was started, we actually didn't even know how common were pediatric cardiomyopathies, what types were more common, and what happened to those patients. So this was a study that was performed by Dr. Lipschultz in the Northeast and Dr. Tobin in Texas, and it looked at 2 places in the United States, and it enrolled 2 regions, 1990 and 1995, expanded to 98 centers in the United States, all comers of cardiomyopathies seen at those centers, and this has been a very powerful registry to tell us a lot about the incidence of the types of cardiomyopathy and the outcomes of cardiomyopathies. everything we know about what happens to a patient with a dilated cardiomyopathy who presents in heart failure, or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, restrictive non-compaction, or it's all been from this Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry in the United States. We've also learned some things about risk factors for worse and better outcomes in patients, meaning we have been able to analyze these patients because we have a large group of over 1,000 patients that we can see who does better and who does worse. When we look at their outcomes, whether they got transplanted, whether they had other issues, or else even just whether or not they had a good quality of life. So it's been a very, very productive and important registry that has informed a lot of how we practice today. But it is a registry. It wasn't randomized. We didn't have therapeutic options A and B, so we were really unable to assess therapies with this. Again, a limitation of a retrospective and prospective cohort study, but still showing how powerful this is. And it could be some of the people on this webinar have participated in the cohort studies. It's been a really good partnership with our patients. I think everybody has benefited from learning more about how we see and treat these patients. This cohort study has then progressed, where we completed a study funded by the NIH and NHLBI. The Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry, in a different form, was able to publish just this past year genetic causes of cardiomyopathy in children. So the genes of people with cardiomyopathy were taken and sent to a lab to study for mutations. And in that, we were able to see that dilated cardiomyopathies, hypertrophic cardiomyopathies, restrictive cardiomyopathies, and LV non-compaction cardiomyopathies all had genes that were associated with the development of the disease. The most common cardiomyopathy that had genetic components was the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which we do know about. But dilated cardiomyopathy, restrictives, and LV non-compactions were also found to have a pretty high incidence of genetic malformations. And that's an interesting finding, and finding out the genes that affect the heart that cause these cardiomyopathies is the first step to starting to treat the cardiomyopathies, not at the end stage where the heart's not working well, but back in the beginning where the genes and the proteins they develop, the proteins they produce can be altered, hopefully to reverse the cardiomyopathy process in a child. To go to another important registry, the Pediatric Heart Transplant Study Registry has been ongoing now for over 30 years, 1995 to 2021. And this study is involving 58 centers in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and Brazil, virtually all transplant patients in the United States where pediatrics are entered in this study. This study has, again, helped us care for patients undergoing transplant and evolved our knowledge of how we can best treat things like rejection, infection, the chronic diseases we might see after immunosuppression, and how we can make it better. And that has also spurred some studies that looked at how we treat people better, what kind of therapies we can use to treat antibody-mediated rejection. So again, the power of a registry that has evolved into an observational cohort study, and in some cases, in clinical trials. This is a collaboration that has also been very valuable for the doctors. We all practice in our own little worlds in different places, all the way from Stanford to Newcastle on Tyne, the United Kingdom, to Brazil. But when we get together, we can share our information of patients that we've cared for, share our ways of treating them, talk to each other about challenging patients that we might not have seen before, but maybe someone in the world has. And that's been a very valuable outcome of research, not only in its individual studies, but also informing collaborations amongst the people in the world who take care of children with transplant and making our care better in that way. Now let's go to randomized clinical trials. We're going to spend just a little bit of time thinking about a randomized clinical trial that was performed in adults. It was called the Copernicus trial, published in 2001. So really the Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry and the Transplant Registry were started in the early 90s, mid 90s. But past that, about 5 or 6 years later, our adult colleagues published this study saying we are doing clinical trials looking at therapies to see if we can make cardiomyopathies better. And this trial was one of the first trials to say, let's see if we can use carvedilol, a beta blocker that we commonly use now for pediatric cardiomyopathies, but it was given to adults for the very first time in this trial. If you look at it, they had 1,100 patients who got placebo and about 1,100 patients who got treatments. The whole study included about 2,200 patients, adult patients. They were treated for 10 months to see if they did better. I mean, how did they define better? They defined better was if they didn't die, because adults have a very high mortality when they have a cardiomyopathy. And they saw the patients who got carvedilol had a much better survival of almost 2 years after receiving the drug compared to the patients who didn't get carvedilol, what they call the placebo group. And this trial was so effective that it was stopped early because the Data Safety Monitoring Board felt that it wasn't fair to not give everyone carvedilol, seeing that the patients who got it did so much better. So that was what they call a pivotal study in the area of treatment of heart failure in adults to say this drug, which no one ever used before in heart failure, really did make people better. So after that, a group of pediatric cardiologists led by Dr. Bob Chatty got together and said, okay, well, we would like to study this in pediatrics. Let's do a study of carvedilol in children with cardiomyopathy and see if those patients had the same kind of benefits. So again, this study had 2,200 patients in it. Carvedilol trial in children went on for a good 8 years, and it was only able to enroll 186 patients. And why is that? It's because luckily cardiomyopathy is not as common in children as it is in adults. So it was good that we could enroll as many patients, but not so great because it was harder to see differences. However, even with the small number of patients, what we saw is that patients who got carvedilol had the same percentage of them get better under treatment. So the placebo group who didn't get carvedilol and the patients who got carvedilol, over half of them improved over the year that they were followed. And it was very similar in the patients who got worse. Maybe a little tiny bit lower in the carvedilol patients, but when they did statistics, they really saw this is probably due to chance. So this trial showed that carvedilol really didn't help patients who had ventricular dysfunction or an echo that showed that the ventricle wasn't working well. One of the problems of the study was that we enrolled patients who had congenital heart disease and we enrolled patients who had primary cardiomyopathies, and the data was mixed, a little bit mixed with those two groups, and showed that the patients who had a cardiomyopathy without congenital heart disease actually did have improvement, whereas those who had congenital heart disease and a cardiomyopathy did a little worse. So overall, the analysis showed no difference, but it did argue for giving carvedilol to our primary cardiomyopathy patients with dilated cardiomyopathy, as we do today, based on this research. Now, what happened though? Why was there such a difference? Well, look at the difference between the groups. In this trial, patients enrolled, again, 133 patients got drugged, 161 patients in the children, so a lot fewer patients. The ages were so different, 63-year-old adults versus 3-year-old children. And the causes of the cardiomyopathy, over 2/3 of them had a heart attack that caused the cardiomyopathy, where in our children, we had children with cardiomyopathy and congenital heart disease. So such different groups. Wasn't surprising that the results were very different as well. Interestingly, when we looked, the mortality was also pretty high in the patients who got the adult patients who got the carvedilol, but it actually wasn't that much different in the children who got carvedilol, showing that having a cardiomyopathy still is not great in a child, and there still is a lot of room to make people better in this group. So this is the strength of a clinical trial. You learn information, but it's also one of the limitations of clinical trials in children is that we have a lot of things we have to think about that don't really affect the adult patients. But once again, why it argues why you have to do research in children, because you can't take the adult data and just translate it if it's been studied in older patients who've had heart attacks and take it into children who are 3 years old who have cardiomyopathy. So this is the sort of idea behind randomized controlled trials in children, but there is also some stimuli for pediatric drug studies that comes from both the United States government and the European Union. The FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, in 2001, enacted the Best Pharmaceuticals Act for Children Act. This was actually done by Congress, where they said, listen, we're not studying drugs in children. We really should study them. And the way to get a company to invest in a child study was to give them some financial benefit. So if a drug company can do a trial in children, they get a 6-month extension in their patent exclusivity, which for a drug that is used widely for an adult indication, it's a big financial benefit. It can be worth millions of dollars to a company. So they will now actually more willingly do a trial in children, even though it might be a small trial that would cost more money than it would cost to do in adults. There was also another act enacted by Congress, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, which also requires companies to write a pediatric assessment for any drug that they're proposing, so that they can say, could this drug be used in children? What would be the risks? What would be the benefits? What do we think it could be used for? What do we need to know in order to make sure it's used safely in children? So the FDA had two, a carrot, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, and the stick saying you have to do this, enacted by law in Congress. And these two acts of legislation are actually in practice today and stimulate a lot of companies to do research in children, which is what we call industry-funded research. The European Medicines Agency, again, the European counterpart for the FDA, enacted similar rules, even a little more encouraging companies to do studies. They approved the Pediatric Initial Plan policy, and which said that before they got approval for a new medication in adult population, before they could even sell that drug, they had to submit a plan on how they would study it in children to this European Medicine Agency. Without it, they could not market a drug. So even if it looked really good in trials, unless they said how were they going to use it in children, they weren't going to be able to actually sell it, which is a big stick for a company that has a drug that's been very successfully used for a disease that is pretty common. And the industrial partners who did get an approved, they call it PIP, got a 6-month extension in their patent exclusivity in Europe. Again, a financial carrot, because that brings in a lot of money to drug companies if they have a drug that they're going to be able to market widely to adults. So these two financial incentives and regulatory incentives were also very helpful to cause the idea of clinical trials in children to come more into fruition over the past 15 years. They also in Europe have the Pediatric Use Marketing Authorization, which if they get a study approved, they can then use that as an approval for use in children, or the PUMA, which says that we have looked at the safety and the efficacy, and we think this drug should be used in children. So I think from this talk, you can understand that I'm pretty in favor of doing studies, but let's think of the sort of major arguments for doing a study in children to do research. I think first is we have a better understanding of the disease and its effects on the child. We know a lot about how cardiomyopathy might affect the echocardiogram. Do we know exactly how it affects a child and the child's life? I would say we still need to know more information about that, and that can only be done through a research study in which people collaborate and people take the data that they get and put it together and look at it so they can say more than the patient in front of them. Maybe they can talk about 100 or 200 or 1,000 patients with this disease and see what actually it does to impact the life of the child. We also very much need to have evidence-based or research-based or data-based information that can help us choose the best treatments. Some of the trials have shown that treatments we thought would work don't work. And some of the trials have shown us that treatments that we didn't think would work are actually effective to alter an important part of a child's life in a child who has cardiomyopathy. And only through research can we have a better understanding of how our treatments affect our children. And the argument that studies in adults that showed benefits to patients exist, but it's not clear if those same benefits would happen in children because of the things I pointed out. Children are not small adults. They have different metabolism, they have different diseases, They have different ways of using a medication, and they have different outcomes that we're looking for. And in addition to thinking about taking adult data and putting it into children for those medications that are used in adults, there's also a growing body of knowledge about disease-specific therapies that are being developed and are going to need to be studied in children because they're the ones that are most affected by a genetic defect. And that's happening already with Pompe's disease and some of the other diseases. People are saying, okay, we now know the gene. How can we change what that gene's doing so that child's cardiomyopathy will get better? You have to study that to see if it's getting better because some of those therapies have certain side effects that can be very dangerous to children. You wouldn't want to use it if the therapy wasn't going to work. The only way to find out is to do research and study patients and look at them very carefully to see if they're getting better with the treatment or the treatment is worse than the disease. That calls into looking at the safety of medication. We can say, oh, it worked well in adults, but we don't know. Maybe it will affect the developing kidney, the developing brain in a child. And we need to study so we can make sure that everything we do might help something get better, but also making sure it doesn't make another thing get worse. And that leads to the idea of do no harm and equipoise. I think it's important for us all to understand that we, as doctors, have biases. We've heard, oh, one child did great or one child did not so well on a drug. That's not really data. That's one experience. As we know, everybody's experience can be a little different. Equipoise is the term we use to say to ourselves, we don't actually know what's better and what's worse. And if we don't know what's better and what's worse, but we have a hope or a suspicion or some data that shows something might be better, then it's our responsibility to study that. And at the same time, we also have to make sure that we're not going to do harm by starting a medication that we don't know really works, because we would feel terrible if it affected the kidneys or something else in the child that we didn't expect and we didn't get the benefit that we wanted to see. So the principles of do no harm and equipoise are very important as we think about designing research trials. That's how investigators choose what drugs they want to use. We look back and we say, do we think there's a good reason it will work in a child? Do we think there's a good reason it will work for this disease? Does it seem safe in animal and adult studies? And does that make it seem like we're going to be able to study this and also have an answer at the end of our study? In addition, why do a study? What I just told you about the best pharmaceuticals in Pediatrics Act, the European Medicine Agencies Act, is there is a financial benefit to the industry sponsor to do a trial. And that's been a very important addition to our armamentarium to encourage people to do research. Research studies are expensive. They can go into the millions of dollars, and it's important for us to make sure that we have those financial resources to do the study, and that can come from industry if it doesn't come from our government, the NIH or NHLBI. Just to do a little practical business about how do you actually enroll in a study if you're interested in research. First is you have to learn about a study. So that often comes through your doctor, your nurse practitioner taking care of you. You might read about it on a website or the internet if you're looking about the disease your child has. You might see a flyer in the clinic where you go to see your doctors, because people do advertise drug studies, other therapeutic studies, by trying to reach the patients where they come to touch the medical system. Once you learned about a study, what happens? Well, you can contact that place that's doing the study and they will screen you. They will screen your child to say, is your child appropriate for this study? The inclusion, meaning you can be included if you have certain diseases, if you have certain characteristics. And the exclusion criteria, meaning you shouldn't really be included because you might have a side effect or there might be something that would keep you from having success with the treatments. They are very clearly laid out in clinical trials. And the study site can look at you or look at your child and decide, okay, you do or do not meet the inclusion criteria. And if you do meet the criteria, then you can go on to talk about enrolling in the study. And that's using the informed consent process. The informed consent process is designed so people who agree to be in studies understand what the study is, why they can be in the study, and what are the effects of the study on them, what are the potential risks, and what are the potential benefits, and what will they be required to do. Parents or the legal guardian sign the informed consent, and children, usually if they're over the age of 6 years, also sign the consent, because children, although maybe can't make their decisions independently, should be allowed to express whether or not they do or do not want to participate in a study with testing and other things that they will have to experience. If you actually enroll and sign a study consent, then procedures happen and visits happen and people are seen at a certain interval so that we can compare people at different intervals in time. Tests and labs are done and monitoring is done to make sure the safety of that intervention, that treatment is maintained and there's no surprises. And once the study is done, hopefully the study subjects will learn about the results at the same time the investigators do these days. We publish papers, we send out notices to people to say, hey, listen, you participated in this study and this is what happened. And this is what we learned. And this is how you helped move the field forward. How do you find out about studies? This is a really great resource. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. It's run by the National Institutes of Health. And on this website, you can type in any disease you like, add on another disease, or add on an age, or add on another interest, drug studies. You can add in a country, and you can search, and it will give you all the studies that have those search words in them. And it tells you what the studies are doing. Are they enrolling? Are they a closed enrollment but studying the results? Are they actively looking for patients and recruiting? This clinicaltrials.gov is a requirement for any trial that is being run through NIH or government funds, but also many centers participate because they want to tell people, I'm doing the study, and also sometimes they do need patients to participate. So you can find about studies all around the country by looking at clinicaltrials.gov to see if it's something you might be interested in. I happened to look quickly at the site yesterday. Right now, there are only 2 actively enrolling studies in pediatric heart failure. One is a study of Entresto, a new medication for chronic heart failure in children that's run from Novartis and has many of the investigators that are part of the Pediatric Transplant study group and the Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry participating. And then there's actually a trial of the Pumpkin device, which is a ventricular assist device, and it's being used in children with cardiomyopathy. So those are the 2 trials that are ongoing. Surprisingly, not very many for a country of over 350 million people. If you look at patients with cardiomyopathy, there are 46 studies listed, but only 6 are actively enrolling or actively analyzing. And looking at the genetics and the biomarkers that are seen in the Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry, and also some studies on stem cell therapies. Again, it's possible to go and look and see who's doing them, what are the investigators, you can contact them, ask them questions, and it's a great resource for finding out about more of what people in the field are thinking of for the future for children with cardiomyopathy. Just a little bit about the informed consent process. So how does that work? The informed consent process is that key piece to decide if you want to participate in a trial. Well, you've heard about it, you passed the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but this is really where the investigator sits down and tells you about the trial. They describe the study, they talk about the study visits and tests, they talk about the potential risks of the study drug, the procedures, loss of confidentiality and financial risks of participating in the study. They talk about potential benefits of being in the study. Often they have to tell you they don't know if it's going to be a benefit to you or your child participating because they don't know the reason they're doing the study is because they're not too sure. Treatment A or treatment B will be better. It could be the same or one could be worse. That's certainly true. But there are benefits to participating in the study that are talking about benefits to society that are, I think, intangible, but also in the future, probably going to be a benefit to you and your family as things progress. We are learning quite a lot about diseases from children who participate in studies in ways that maybe aren't really related to the treatments, but just learning what does happen to people if we watch them for 3 or 4 years as they're in the study. The informed consent also tells you what happens if you don't want to participate. And every study has a statement saying people will take care of you in just the way you need to be taken care of, whether or not you participate in this study. And that's really important. It is everyone's choice to say, I'm not up for this study. Everyone, all the investigators understand that. We completely agree if you don't want to participate, and we would not treat you any differently. If you decided not to be in a study, we would give you the therapies that you need, and also give you therapies that we think would help, even if we're not quite sure. And then any other considerations are usually also in the consent form. Anything else you might need to know about the particular treatments, the particular studies, the particular things that they're looking at. And then a parent, a guardian, and the child, as I said, over 6 would sign that consent form to say, yes, I understand. And one of the things to know is that even though you sign a consent form, you can always decide not to participate in the study. It's not a promise for the rest of your life. It's just a promise at the time I agree to do it. So that it's possible anytime as the study goes on, you could say, well, I don't think I want to be in this anymore. The investigators also are looking to see if the study is still valid, or if there's changes and new knowledge, they can stop the study as well. So it's not that you're signing your life away by signing the consent. You're just saying, no, at this time, I think I would like to participate in the study. And as things evolve, you and your study team can decide whether or not the study should go on or you should stay in the study. So what is the role of research in clinical trials in improving care in pediatric cardiomyopathy? As I said, I think one of the important things we learn about research is we're gathering data about the diseases and their outcomes that we still don't know. We still don't know how people will be 20 or 30 years after being diagnosed with cardiomyopathy because the research hasn't been going on that long. There are things we need to know by having our families participate in registries and retrospective and prospective outcome studies. This research will also provide information, as I said, to guide decision-making of the care team to achieve the best outcomes. I have to say one of the things that we really want to know is what are the best outcomes? What are the risks and benefits of treatment versus no treatment? And how do people perceive that? Not only the doctors, but the families. And we really want to ensure that the right patient gets the right treatment at the right time. The only way to do that is to do research to find out what happens when you give a patient a treatment at a certain time, so we can understand what the risks and benefits are. I think if we talk about a summary and how we think about important questions for research that we don't know, we still don't know all the risks and benefits of the treatments we do, and that's what the research is going to help us answer. We also, most importantly, don't even know how we would say, oh, this is a good treatment to have. What's a good outcome? We often talk about survival without transplant, or survival of the heart, but that's kind of a big benchmark. There should be other things now that our survival is improved. And what would that be? Well, what kind of complications will the patients have if they do or they don't get a treatment? What kind of neurocognitive effects might a treatment or not getting a treatment have on a child that's developing, going to school, interacting with their families, interacting with their friends? We also want to know what kind of physical capacities will our children have? Will they play sports? Will they be on the soccer team? Can they swim? Can they go for a bike ride with their family? And then ultimately, certainly, the happiness or quality of life of the child would be the ultimate best outcome. How is that child? Are they happy? Are they doing what they'd like to do with whatever stage of life they're at? And I think that's really the goal for all of research, is to get our patients to have these good outcomes in every aspect, and that research needs to be inclusive, and research needs to be performed, and research needs to be generalizable, which is why I'm very much in favor of having research involvement in our families taking care of themselves by saying, yes, I'm going to find an answer so I can know my child's going to be better in a year, in 5 years, or 10 years. So thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. I'm happy to take any questions, and certainly my email's on here if people would like to write to me if they want to talk about a question that's a little less, maybe more personal. I'm happy to also talk about research in that way. So
Thank you so
I'd
much.
like to thank the CCF for inviting me. I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions anybody has.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Hsu. That was very, very informative. So we've got a couple of questions. The first one, they say, it is so refreshing to hear from a leader in cardiomyopathy research. In your opinion, what is the most exciting or forward-thinking study going on currently?
Well, I think that what's exciting is people are thinking about new therapies for heart failure as they've been using. There's a lot of new drugs in adult patients, and we need to find out if they're going to work in children. So the Entresto study, that's called it's called the Paradigm study, the Pinnacle. To start with the P, some Entresto study is really very helpful to find out if that drug is safe. And there are new drugs coming along. I think that what's happening in the FDA is they're understanding that it's difficult for us to find 2,200 patients to enroll in a trial. So they're actually thinking of different ways to do research where we could sort of leverage stuff that we know about adults and apply it to the pediatric population. We're having actually a seminar from the FDA in the beginning of September, and it might be available. I could actually send you that, Susan, where a lot of the experts from industry, FDA, and clinicians are getting together to say, how can we do better research better in children? I think that genetic research, although still a pie in the sky, is a very exciting idea. I really do believe that finding out about the genetic defects associated with cardiomyopathy are going to help us figure out what therapies are going to work that's going to take care of the disease, not take care of the end product of the poor function. I think that's far away. I think there's a lot of side effects and concerns with the therapies as you try to insert different genes into people. But I do think that's going to be pretty cool. And I do think there is some research about transplantation, about better ways to manage new hearts or mechanical hearts, that I'm hopeful within the next 10 years will take away some of the problems, immunosuppression, the side effects of transplantation, and still give people the benefit of having a new heart pump that works better than their old one. So those are the things I'm thinking about that are exciting.
Great. A couple of more questions for you. And I know that this one isn't necessarily about what you were talking today, but I'm sure some people in this webinar may have questions. We have the new Delta variant that it's making its way, pretty prolifically around the country. And what should, parents and families and caregivers be aware of as it relates to COVID, the vaccine, the Delta variant, and cardiomyopathy?
The first is to know that I think what we've learned is that social distancing, masks, and hand washing do actually work. So that's very reassuring, right? Because we're not going to get rid of the Delta virus or COVID. So how can you protect yourselves? I use the example of my staff and I have been working every day. We go to the hospital. We see patients with COVID. we actually interact with people who have COVID, and we wear our masks and we wash our hands. And I can say none of my faculty, none of my fellows have gotten ill from interactions with patients. So that works. So not to be so worried about an interaction with a person who has COVID, if you're careful. And that does mean trying to keep yourself careful so you don't transmit the disease, and also trying to teach your children, who are very good. Even the smallest children will hold out their hand and ask for the hand sanitizer if I offer it to them. And that's, I think, the best. So just, we have to try to get on with our lives. But I do think, of course, like everyone in the medical profession who's a physician, feels that the vaccine is really a good thing to have. Not that it's 100% safe, not that there aren't reports of things happening, but if you look at the reports of things happening with the vaccine and you compare it to the reports of what happens when you have COVID, you assess risks and benefits. The risk of the vaccine is less than the risk of getting COVID. So that's why we are encouraging all our children to get the vaccine. What we're seeing is if you have the vaccine, you are not going to get as sick. You have COVID. People get colds all the time. We'll have a cold, but you won't get sick in the way that we read about, such those sad stories. So I think, and if you can get a vaccine, if children are eligible, I would really encourage people to think very seriously about it. And then anybody who is eligible for the vaccine, who lives in the family, again, those people are going to hopefully not transmit it as much. The disease won't be as severe. So everyone should think about not only their safety, but the safety of people around them. But I see a lot of problems with children having been home for a year and a half. I see a lot of issues with kids. It's such an important thing to learn to interact with the world, to learn to be on your own, to learn to have a fight with a child or with your friend and make up. And You need to get that experience as a young child and get it through adolescence in order to become a fully functioning adult. So I hope that people will really think seriously about getting their children back into the lives of school. But it depends on the safety of the school, safety of the people around you, how they're viewing masks and hand washing. Because I do think you can be in a room, you hand wash and mask, you're going to be okay. If you can convince people to do that, those measures, even without the vaccine.
Okay, great. Just a couple of more questions and then we will wrap it up. You mentioned a lot of interesting statistics. One that stood out to me was, greater than 50% of drugs being used on children haven't even been, tested. And so that's really concerning. But you talked about some of these financial incentives for pharmaceutical companies who are doing this research and development, which is great. But ultimately, we have to get enrollees in studies and clinical trials in order for those drugs to actually be able to come to market. As you're talking with families, those who may have reservations in enrolling in a trial because, nothing is guaranteed, what are some of the things that you talk to them about? You talked a little bit about the societal benefit a few minutes ago, but would just like you to kind of elaborate on that.
I usually do start with, we don't actually know what the right thing to do is. Because I think people think, oh, well, if it's a study of a drug A, then that drug A must be good because they're studying it. But actually, we don't know drug A is good. And we hope it would be good. So we, of course, wouldn't do the study if we didn't think maybe there would be some help. But I've done 2 studies now where it wasn't helpful. And turns out, why would you take a drug the rest of your life if it's actually not going to help? So I do think there's a benefit to the child not being in the study itself, but the results of every study will benefit you. And your doctors are doing things to keep you safe. You have to have faith in the people that care for your child. We're not going to ask or do something that we feel is unsafe. The first thing we do is say, is it safe? If it's safe, then we feel comfortable giving it. But that doesn't mean we should give it because it could be perfectly safe, but doesn't do any good at all. So I think to understand that the people who are talking to you are vetting safety very carefully, which is why we don't give you new drugs usually for the heart failure drugs. We give them after they've given them to 55,000 adults. We know what the safety profile is. And we think, okay, this is really, really safe. The argument should not be it's so safe we should give it anyway, though, because sometimes it doesn't work. And again, you shouldn't take a drug, even if it's got just a tiny bit more risk if it's not going to work. So I try to tell people that. I find the carvedilol trial, if you look, everyone got better. That really was surprising to us. Being in a trial, you're watched a little more closely, and there's always this effect that if you're watched more closely, everybody does better. So there might not be a benefit to getting treatment A or treatment B, but there's a little benefit to being those people that we call all the time and check on. And so it's not that you don't get any benefit at all. We also get to watch children grow, and everybody seemed to be so much fun at the end of the carvedilol trial because we got to see them a lot more than we usually do. So there is interactions like that we're doing a little more with video visiting that we not have to come in. So I try to tell people that, and I do find the people who participate do have a little bit of altruism in them. They do say this, there's also, they want to make it better for all the kids because they know how hard it is to have an illness and to not know all the answers. And they're really, they say, okay, well, I'm really going to do this because it's going to make everybody have more information, and all the families affected by this later down the road will benefit, as I benefit from the people who came before me and did those studies. So it is kind of paying it forward.
Great. Well, Dr. Hsu, that's all the time we have today. Really thank you for this very informative presentation. And for everybody on tonight's webinar, we will post this on our website in a few days, and I would encourage you to share it with other friends and family who are interested in learning more about some of the research studies going on in pediatric cardiomyopathies. So Dr. Hsu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Bye-bye.
CCF is a great organization.
Oh, thank you so much. We appreciate your support. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.